Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to give you an introduction to the British Romantic period. Now, you may remember some of these characteristics when we studied Romanticism in the junior year, but we're going to talk a little bit about reviewing those and how they apply specifically to the British poets that we're going to look at. So first of all, the idea of Romanticism was that it was this literary movement that was a movement away from the neoclassic emphasis on logic and reason. Instead, Romantics emphasized the subjective thing, emotion and spontaneity. And remember, Romanticism, again, when we're talking about literature, has nothing to do with hearts and flowers and people going on dates and all of that. It really does refer to this idea of looking at the world through a certain sensibility. A lot of Romantic literature also shows a love of one's own national literature and literary forms. There's often this idea of this kind of wild writing with exotic and foreign topics. Sometimes objects are contrasted with each other or arranged asymmetrically instead of symmetrically. And again, this really specific love of nature and the countryside. Now, you may remember that Romanticism came about as a response to this earlier 18th century emphasis on science and logic and the idea of being all rational and reasoning. Romanticism came back to the idea of emotion and the idea of humanity and nature. And there's a couple of reasons why there was this response in this movement back to emotional responses as opposed to logical and rational responses. Now, last year we looked at this specifically from the American point of view, but I want to take a look at this from the British point of view for British literature this year. So we know some things about the American Revolution. We know that the American colonies revolted, that they defeated Britain to gain our independence. But what you may not really have thought of is what did this actually do to Great Britain? So from the British viewpoint, this was actually a big psychological blow, the idea that they had lost control and that they'd been defeated by these poor farmers and country people running around. And it also caused them a significant amount of economic problems. They had a lot of debts from the war. They weren't getting any more of the revenue from the colonies. Remember, the colonies were this rich source of all of these industrial and agricultural products. And the government of personal power of a king was really coming to an end. It sort of showed that people really could take charge of their own government. We didn't have to be ruled by kings. A few years after the American Revolution came the French Revolution with a similar kind of idea to get rid of the ruling authority and to let the people sort of run the show. And this was much more dramatic in France than perhaps it was in the United States because they actually took, obviously, the royal family and there were all these beheadings, anyone who was a member of the aristocracy. And at first, the French Revolution in Britain kind of inspired the liberals, this idea that, wow, we can just kind of take over and take the government into our own hands. But after it turned really violent, and then we get Napoleon coming in, kind of led to this conservative clampdown in England and this fear that we would have, that the British would have the same kind of revolution might happen in their country that they had just seen occurring in France. And all of this ushered in the age of Napoleon, this dictator who was trying to take over most of Europe. So for a big chunk of the start of the 19th century, England was at war with France and really concerned that they would be invaded and would be taken over. During this time period, we also saw the Industrial Revolution beginning in England, specifically the idea that people went from being able to make everything themselves and kind of live on their own farms and make their own home and clothing, that production moved from the home into the factory, and the factory is located in the cities, so people moved into the cities looking for more work, the population swelled, and you got these really poor living conditions that came about. So suddenly you had these kind of social situations and economic situations that needed a lot of attention and were causing a lot of suffering and problems. During the Industrial Revolution and the rise of some of these problems from city living and child labor, the government at this time had sort of a laissez-faire policy, and that's a French which really means basically hands off, let people do as they please. So it was letting the business owners operate with any kind of oversight, and this was creating some really awful conditions for people who were living in these times. The rich were growing richer, the poor were suffering more. There were housing, hygiene, health concerns, and the children were very often forced into hard labor during this time period as well, either in the factories or supporting the work that the factories were doing. So you might say, what does any of this have to do with poetry? Well, this is where the Romantics came in, because the Romantics are really dedicated to social change. They saw these issues that were being created with war and city living and the Industrial Revolution, and this interior belief of individual liberty, valuing the imagination, thinking of nature and time spent with organic and living things were really transformative. And this focus on the personal experience and emotions was a really new kind of way of thinking about life and society. So some of the key characteristics of the Romantic movement, and this was something that applied to literature, but also to music and architecture and fashion and all different sorts of styles and expressive movements, is this rejection of the 18th century emphasis on reason, the power of dreams and the subconscious, and this new way of thinking about nature and man's relationship to nature. So a piece of literature from this time period, again, is going to have this focus on the imagination. It's going to have an emphasis on personal experience, not like what general people experience, but what things mean to one individual. A really big hit on sensory details, what things looked like and sounded like and felt like. That you could only experience the truth through nature, that you had to get outside and live through things in order to really understand truth. And that you could find the extraordinary even in the very ordinary, that every single living little thing actually had this extraordinary and deep connection. That got into this idea of the oversoul, the sort of shared universal experience, and this contrast between the natural world and the supernatural world that we'll look at on the next slide. So the poets and writers at this time kind of reached back in time. This idea that the natural universe was a mysterious world of its own, that you had this settings often in this remoteness of time or place, things long in the past. And they were very much inspired by these visions of things that we studied earlier in the course with Arthurian legends and the quest and the ideas of the British druids and medieval knights and chivalry. Now, when we talk about nature in terms of the Romantics, we're really talking about two really distinct things. The first is the idea of the natural world, and the second is the idea of the supernatural world. Now, usually if I say the word nature to you, you're thinking, oh, trees and flowers and outside and all of that. And that's all true. And in the Romantics, the nature took that form. It was the idea of the things that you could see that were organic, that were growing, life-giving, the idea of individuality, that things that you could personally experience. And again, the idea that even a very small thing could contain great truth and beauty, that there was great beauty and majesty and even a small drop of rain or a tiny blade of grass. And this idea that nature has this universal quality, that it doesn't change from time and place, and that every single person on the planet has the ability to go out and experience things from the natural world. Now, on the supernatural side, we divide it into two forms. The first is the godly form, and this is where you'll see an emphasis in the writing on all things that are sort of spiritual and religious. You'll see references to angels, to people's souls, heaven and hell, a concern with sin and salvation, prayer, and the idea of a personal relationship with God, not like what the formal church tells you, but each individual's personal experience of faith. And then you have the dark side, or what we sometimes refer to as the Gothics, the dark romantics. And in this type of literature, you're going to see ghosts and ghost stories, demons, concerns about death, hauntings, hell and punishment, the monsters and macabre kind of world. This is why when we talk about things like Edgar Allan Poe and say he's a romantic author, we're talking again about this literary sensibility of romanticism, not about the idea about writing about people who go on dates and end up getting married and that kind of romance. So you can have this romantic time period with this emphasis on this a supernatural format that can take this kind of dark and ghostly sort of form. Now, in Great Britain, the first piece of work that we look at that we really consider in the literary world to be part of this Romantic movement probably goes back to a book of poems that was published called Lyrical Ballads. And this was a collaboration of two of the greatest British Romantic poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. And this came out in 1798 and was really hailed as this sort of new kind of poetry, that it was about everyday sorts of things. I'm not going to write about the epic battle of Beowulf. I'm going to write about daffodil, just a single flower. And this idea that this poetry reflected this kind of emotion and self-revelation and exactly what I'm experiencing right now, and this bond between nature and the human mind. And this really set it apart from the works that had been popular and that we see coming before this. So that's a basic review of Romanticism and how it came about in Great Britain. On the next presentation, we're going to be talking about the Big Six poets, some of the people who are most important to this movement in British literature.